to it. Okay. All right. How's my mic? Can you all hear me okay? Awesome. All right. Well, I'll get started sharing my screen. I'll share my screen instead of my. Can you all see my slides? Great. I think I saw some nods and thumbs
Yeah,
up. Let
yes.
me. Oh, thank you. Okay. I always like to put your cameras on my second computer just so I can still see y'all. Okay. So, a little context for today. We have a small grant, some of you know, to evaluate memory cafes. There's a few functions within that grant. Part of it is to evaluate the impact of memory cafes on family caregivers and people living with dementia who attend them at a regular rate. You know, we're evaluating at least 2, but most people, if they've attended 2, they've attended more. And so within that, we are evaluating loneliness and social support, but part of the grant project is to also train volunteers to sort of build a sort of volunteer workforce, I guess, for memory cafes in South Texas and beyond. I think a few people who might be joining later are some people from Arizona and Dallas, so a little further north. I wanted to join this training. So things kind of changed. We submitted that grant pre-COVID when volunteers were able to, we could easily keep 5 to 6 volunteers busy at our memory cafes in person. And now things are a little different because it's a little harder to have volunteers. So we kind of maybe will only have 1 or 2 per memory cafe online. So what we did is we adapted this to be a training also for coordinators. So there's going to be information both for memory cafe coordinators, interested coordinators, and also volunteers for memory cafes. And I will touch on both in-person and virtual, but I'll probably try to emphasize a little more the virtual side, given that memory cafes are for older adults. Typically, not everybody living with dementia is an older adult, but for the most part, one of our more vulnerable populations. So I imagine memory cafes will pretty much be virtual through at least January. I don't know. There's no real timeline for this. So we will focus on virtual. And let me admit Ashley is here. Okay. So I put together, and I will send you these after today's presentation. I put together a resource pack, which is a Google folder, which please let me know if you can see this. Can you see a Google folder now? Okay, great. So this will be a sort of living folder. I will update it periodically. And in this folder, I will keep putting in resources that are useful to both coordinators and volunteers of memory cafes. I'm all for open education and sharing, so I will put in some of the activity materials and supplies that I've used for my virtual memory cafe into here and some instructions. So if you want to go on and take that into your own memory cafe, you can feel free to do that. So just to familiarize you, I'll try to zoom in a little so you can see a little better. We have some resources. So today's training manual is in here with clickable links, so you can navigate through the document pretty easily. I have an idea starter pack, so some of the activities that I found were most successful both in person and virtual. A memory cafe criteria checklist, which came out of a literature review that we did with students for a few months. And by attending memory cafes online and participating in other networks, this criteria checklist kind of came out to help you kind of get a better sense of the mandatory sort of criteria for, let me ask Jennifer or somebody, Carol, I think you have co-hosting. If people enter, do you mind letting them in if you hear the bell? I got it this round, but I don't think so. If more people come. So there's also a link in this folder to get dementia-friendly certified, so you can do that here. So just keep in mind, when I finish this, I'll send you a link to this resource pack, and you'll have all these resources available to you, and it'll be updated periodically. So if you think of something you think should be added here, please let me know, and I'll throw it in there for everybody. Okay, so back to our presentation. So today I'm going to be covering an overview of memory cafes. A lot of us already know, a lot of us who are here know what memory cafes are, have either volunteered or attended a memory cafe or even host one themselves, but a lot of us don't. So I'm going to do a brief overview of memory cafes, and it always is just helpful to remind ourselves of, what we're doing with these. Then we'll talk about how to host dementia-friendly memory cafes. They are a dementia-friendly America activity, so we're going to kind of walk through what makes them dementia-friendly. I'll go through some of the logistics about coordinating a memory cafe, and then some of the logistics around volunteering. And then I'll walk you through just a slide with some additional resources that might be helpful. And these are all navigatable too. So when you receive this, you can click through the presentation as you want. So what is a memory cafe? Memory cafes are an opportunity for families living with dementia to socialize with others in a safe, supportive, and inclusive environment. So sometimes it's helpful to think of what they are not. They're not necessarily a support group. They're not necessarily a class or a workshop, but they might indirectly offer some of the benefits of those activities. Really, this is a space for people living with dementia, family members, friends, health professionals, anyone with a sort of interest in dementia and family caregiving can get together in an environment without worrying about being judged. It's a supportive environment, and a part of our grant, we've been doing some interviews with family caregivers and people living with dementia who attend regularly, and we're finding that there are so many benefits beyond just the sort of relaxation and social element. A lot of peer support, learning, and in an environment that's inclusive and understanding. So they really are a powerful mechanism for supporting families living with dementia. And they are a space to celebrate what is still possible while living with dementia. I think there, and Carol kind of noted this again yesterday when we were talking about today, a lot of attention is focused on what's not possible after a diagnosis and what's not possible for people living with dementia to do. And I think memory cafes are a really great example of celebrating what still is possible and highlighting the sort of joys that can still exist while living with dementia. They focus on facilitating conversations, creativity, and connections with others. So for people living with dementia, memory cafes offer the chance to relax and enjoy an environment free of judgment and pressure. And for care partners, they're a welcomed break from the 36-hour workday. Oh yeah, thank you, Ashley. So this is a sweet photo that was taken at one of our memory cafes. Actually, our last in-person memory cafe this year in February. We celebrated Valentine's Day together, and we decorated photo frames and took photos on site and printed them. And this is a couple that many of us are familiar with. Desiree smiling, you know them. And they had a really great time. So they still attend memory cafes regularly online now. Okay, so what are the key components of a memory cafe? This list of key components came from the lit review that I mentioned we did with our students over the last few months, and also working with other memory cafes. There isn't that much literature on memory cafes, but what we can sort of extrapolate is there are a few core components that are almost necessary to call your event a memory cafe. But then there's this long list of additional components that can kind of give your memory cafe its unique flavor. So number one is it's a welcoming space for persons living with dementia and care partners. It's an event that they can attend together. And it's not, I like to focus on also what they're not, respite or a day program. So you won't see memory cafes where family caregivers just drop off their family member who's living with dementia. This is something that if somebody living with dementia wants to attend on their own, that's totally fine, but it doesn't operate as respite. So from the planning side of things, you keep that in mind. You don't necessarily need to provide skilled nursing or something like that to offer respite services. Ideally, you're creating an environment where families can do this together. So it's open and accessible to anyone. So all should be welcomed without discrimination. In a
I have
virtual environment.
I
Yes,
have a
hi.
question. Typically, when you're doing your, I guess, like in person, do you have just like the person living with dementia and then someone else joining them, or is it like a whole family or children? How does that work?
All are welcome.
Okay.
So we typically, what we see is families, either a spouse and their partner, or we have quite a few parent and adult child groups that attend our memory cafes. Trying to think in person. We had partnered in person with a program that provides free transportation for homebound seniors, so that was really helpful. There were people who might not necessarily have yet been diagnosed with dementia, but might be experiencing. So we just had a wide variety of people in person. And now that we're online, we even have, I was highlighting this to Carol, we actually have some folks who are living with dementia who just attend on their own. When we were in person, children were frequently involved. Jennifer would bring her children, and we had some families who would bring their grandkids and even great grandkids with them. So it's a wonderful, I love the intergenerational aspect of it. Does that
Thank
answer
you.
your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So they are open and accessible. And I just like to highlight this one because I think globally, and this has been discussed with other memory cafe networks as well, some people tend to use memory cafes as an activity within their communities, especially when you're thinking of memory care facilities. If you have a memory cafe that's only accessible to the families in your memory care center, that's not necessarily a memory cafe. That's an activity, a social activity you're providing. But really, when you're talking about a memory cafe, it's an open space. So as if you're opening it up to your community, that really is sort of one of the core features of a memory cafe. So the location and atmosphere, in person are hosted in community settings, once again, to have that open and accessible element. And it's more like a social gathering in its atmosphere than like a clinical program or a class. You really want to highlight this sort of like conversational connection, social engagement, and networking aspect, which in a way is a lot easier in person. In virtual, you should strive for a social atmosphere, so encourage the use of video, try to learn people's names, encourage conversation not just between the host and the families attending, but between families as much as possible, and allow time for attendees to speak. I have a bad habit of talking over people, so as a coordinator, that's one of my big struggles, is making space for other people to speak freely. So they're scheduled regularly. A memory cafe isn't a one and done thing. It should be something that people can come to rely on as a social opportunity for them. I found that generally speaking, people like to host their memory cafes once a month because a lot of planning does go into them. And I'm finding virtual, and maybe Josie can speak to this, virtual takes a lot of planning ahead of time. Making things feel organic in a virtual environment takes a lot of planning, and you have to think of every little thing as a coordinator. So it really does help. I think monthly is sort of the sweet spot, but memory cafes around the world sometimes meet weekly, sometimes they're bi-weekly, as long as that there's some regularity. And the general consensus is you don't want to go more than a month. So you don't really want to go bi-monthly or quarterly. That's that's sort of different and doesn't really help people foster the relationships with each other as easily. So the activities should be focused on socialization. Even when you're considering an educational topic, you want to highlight the social aspect of that as well. So all memory cafes have a primary goal of promoting social interaction between persons living with dementia and caregivers and with others in their communities. You can include education, creative expression, physical activity, but your primary goal is that networking and peer support and socialization. So in a virtual memory cafe, you should encourage socialization within your households, but also within, so you might have a person living with dementia and their care partner, and maybe even another person from their household. And you want to foster connection between them, but you also want to foster connection with others in the virtual room as well, which is a lot easier said than done. So all memory cafes have a designated facilitator, and I tend to use facilitator as the person to describe the person facilitating the activity, but people tend to use it interchangeably with coordinator. So in my mind, I'm a coordinator, Diane's a coordinator, Noe is a coordinator with me, but we might invite facilitators of activities. I just highlight this because there is no memory cafe that exists where people just show up and there's not a person giving direction, or, it's not necessarily like a club of people. There's usually somebody who kind of runs the show, so to speak. So the term is loose and includes trained volunteers who are sometimes former caregivers. There are quite a few memory cafes, and especially when in the literature review, we found that a lot of memory cafes are coordinated by people, especially care partners whose loved one might have moved into a memory care center or passed away, who then are committed to staying active and involved in the dementia community. So they then take on starting a memory cafe. So one of the key features is that they're tailored to the interests of the attendees. And so this is where I think the strength of the memory cafes really show. Every memory cafe has these core components that I'm walking through, but the unique culture and atmosphere and sort of flavor of your memory cafe comes from you responding in your planning to the interests of your community. So what might be interesting to a community in North San Antonio in this neighborhood is different from a neighborhood even down the street. And so you can kind of, if you're being really responsive to your attendees, your memory cafe will really take a unique shape and will be much more compelling for families to keep attending. So that really, and I'm gonna touch on this quite a lot in today's presentation. So speeding along, there are additional components to memory cafes. And if you, when I guess I can try clicking on this, let's see. There is a checklist, so I can show you. In the checklist, you'll see, and this came from the Lit Review, the required to constitute a memory cafe are listed, and I walked you through the required today. But if you scroll down, you'll see some of the additional elements that are typical to memory cafes, but not necessarily required to your categorizing your activity as a memory cafe. So typically, there's coffee, tea, and refreshments. But when you're online, that's not necessarily true. You can encourage people to prep a cup of coffee or something, but you see how it's not necessarily required, but it's typical. Registration is something that is very common, but not required. Some people don't require registration. Some memory cafes only want to do one thing, and that's okay. There's a memory cafe in Massachusetts where their whole thing is they meet at an art museum and they discuss a piece of art every month. And that's okay as well. Whereas most memory cafes tend to engage in a diverse range of activities together. So I'll let you walk through these on your own time. They will be accessible to you through the folder that I'll share. Oops. Okay. So
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, just really quickly. When you mentioned the other cafe that did the little art thing, that was really neat. Have you found anything specific? Like, are the crafts better? Are smaller stationed activities easier for people that have dementia? Because I'm thinking about my experience with my own grandmother. I tried to take her to arts and crafts events before at her community center. It was very difficult for me to keep her focused and on a specific activity. So do you find that having multiple stationed activities or multiple things, more of free flowing and organic, is a little bit easier for this specific type of community?
It depends. Yeah. And I know that's such a cheeky answer to say it depends,
No.
but no, it is true. So we've done a range of activities in our memory cafe, from sort of simple craft. And yes, in planning, that's something to consider. People in memory cafes, you'll never ask them their diagnosis. So you don't know if people are coming sort of in the mid and later stages. So you want to make sure everyone's engaged. So
Right.
we have done things in the past where we've had sort of stations and people can kind of gravitate toward whatever activity resonates with them. But I am consistently surprised. I come into planning where I think, is this too complicated? Is this too intimidating? But then we had a painting day at our memory cafe, which was much more, higher quality paints, actually using canvases. And people living with dementia seem to enjoy it quite. We did kind of outline in pencil the shape, so it's a little less intimidating. And I'm finding that generally speaking, if you can address the anxiety and the stigma and the comfort side, usually people will enjoy an activity that you might not have thought that somebody in mid and later stages could engage in. So
Right. That's great.
yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about planning dementia-friendly activities in another slide, but that's a conversation that I love having because a lot of wonderful ideas come out of, when you're trying to design an activity that is still fun for people at different stages.
Sure.
Thank you, Annalisa.
Sure.
And Josie, I see you have a question about evaluation. I do have a section about evaluations coming up. Do you want to sit with your question for a bit and see if I answer it? Okay, I see you nodding, I think. Okay.
Yes, yeah, that'll be fine. Thank you, Sarah.
Awesome, thanks, Josie. Okay, so I always include this because I think it's really important. One of the things that we see globally, and especially in the United States, where memory care centers are privatized often, is that memory cafes are used as a marketing tool to drum up business. And that is not okay. The consensus is that memory cafes should be safe, inclusive spaces, no strings attached. You're not sort of inviting people into this atmosphere and then pummeling them with marketing. That being said, a lot of people at memory cafes do want to know about resources, especially memory care, if people are concerned about that. So it's not wrong to provide that information at a memory cafe, but what is wrong, and I'm guilty of this, is when we were early on planning our memory cafes, we would invite guest speakers in. They might offer to sponsor a memory cafe, and then they would come in with like 5 staff members dressed really businessy, and it just didn't jive with the atmosphere. And then they would stand there and dominate and take 15 minutes, selling their services. That's not okay. Having a brochure outside of the room and inviting people to look if they're interested is okay. So just being mindful of that. So what does a memory cafe look like? I only included pictures of the SA Amigos because I didn't have time to reach out to everybody asking for photos, but I'll show you what the SA Amigos look like. So this was at an animal, therapy animal day. This was at our drum circle. That was the painting day, and you can see everybody did amazingly. Karaoke at our holiday party, painting pumpkins. That was our potluck where we celebrated our heritage and family history. We did a field trip to Morgan's Wonderland. That was wonderful. That was our last in-person one. We took a nice fun group photo, and you can see that it is almost impossible to tell who the people living with dementia are and who the care partners are. And that is exactly what you want to cultivate, an environment where you're not treating people differently based on a diagnosis. And I'll talk more about that in the dementia-friendly section of this presentation. So virtual looks a little different. You can't really tell what activities we did, but we did do, these were all different, papel picado, you can see that. I think this was from our Loteria Day, and this was from Sharing Day. Gustavo, you're front and center. Okay, so moving on, the benefits. Social engagement, peer support. With the emphasis on social engagement being the #1 priority, there are other benefits. So you get peer support, a chance to creatively express, which a lot of us are creative folks in here. Gustavo's a foodie. Gladys, I think you're an artist too, don't you paint? Or was that I don't remember if that was you or if it was Dr. Chacon. But anyway, a lot of us really, really draw a lot from expressing creatively. So that's an opportunity. Meaningful moments with your person living with dementia and care partner, but also with friends. There's an educational element to memory cafes. My favorite form of education is empowering people living with dementia and caregivers to offer education within their conversations. If possible, that's less intimidating than bringing in a speaker. Resource sharing, and then community involvement. There is a sense of sort of community, I don't know, activism, social justice. When you're at a memory cafe, you feel like you're part of something bigger, and I think that really goes a long way for people. I think there's a lot of value in feeling like you supported somebody in your community. So, dementia-friendly memory cafes. So I think a lot of us are familiar with this concept of dementia-friendly, and I'm lucky our expert on Dementia-Friendly America, Jennifer, is here. So please unmute if you want to chime in. Jennifer, I'll try to do this justice. Being dementia-friendly, so there is a Dementia Friends USA training that all of our volunteers, Desiree, Amanda, Tiziana, all of y'all have done this, the in-person and probably the online as well. But at a minimum, it would be great for everybody involved in your memory cafe to at least do the online Dementia Friends training. But if you're interested in having a Dementia Friends training, please reach out to us. We can work with our Dementia Friendly Advisory Board to set that up with you for the in-person or, in-person virtual. So the description from the Dementia Friends USA website is a dementia friend is someone who, through viewing a series of online videos, or attending an in-person session, learns about what it's like to live with dementia, and then turns that understanding into action. And that is really the key component. So as a Memory Cafe coordinator or volunteer, you should aim to view all of the videos and focus especially on the in your community video. And think about how to apply what you learned from that short, it's like 3 or 4 minute video, to the context of a Memory Cafe. And the translation of that knowledge is pretty limitless. Like, you can really see how important it is to implement dementia-friendly behaviors, not only in your day-to-day life, but especially within the context of a memory cafe, especially within the context of a virtual memory cafe, which is sometimes a little more challenging. So when you receive these slides, you can click on this picture and be taken to the Dementia Friends training. So my volunteers might recognize this slide from our orientation back in the day. So how can you be dementia friendly as a coordinator or a volunteer? So you must have respect for people living with dementia. And I think for the most part, if you're here today, you have that. But sometimes we don't know how to translate our respect for people living with dementia into actions. So being willing to be vulnerable and hold yourself accountable. We don't know everything, and we're constantly learning. And what's acceptable for one person living with dementia might not be acceptable for another. So just being willing to own up to any sort of mistakes and being willing to adapt and be accountable for your behavior is a really good place to start. Be mindful of the stigmatization associated with dementia and caregiving. Be patient. I'm not a very patient person, and working with people living with dementia and caregivers who might be coming in stressed is really, really important. So be kind, and very importantly, be present. So eye contact, I know that's hard in a virtual environment, but nodding, trying to show that you're present and engaged with the person can really go a long way with making a person feel welcomed and listened to. Speak clearly, respectfully, and compassionately with everyone. Use person first language. So we always say person living with dementia. And I had a great conversation with Gladys over email about the importance of this in other languages. I do have a slide about bilingual memory cafes, but it really goes a long way. I think some of us might not realize how hurtful it can be to use certain language. It might seem silly to people who are new to this concept of person first language, and that's okay. But putting the person first in your language does exactly that, and it validates their experience beyond the disease or the condition. And that really goes a long way with, even if a person doesn't mind, it really will emphasize that you're thinking of them as a person first. So really try to practice that. It took me a couple of weeks to get used to saying person living with dementia. Thank you, Gustavo. Yeah, but it's easy, and it starts to flow really really easily after a while. So try practicing that if you have to. And refrain from making jokes about the disease and memory lapses. I know it's kind of silly to have to bring this up, but I think a lot of us tend to make jokes when we're uncomfortable. And sometimes when you're interacting with people living with dementia or caregivers who might say something that is heavy, which happens, we might try to lighten the mood by making a joke. Oh, maybe I'm the one who has dementia, if you forget something. That can really hurt a person. And I think in the context of memory cafes, that's important. But in general, don't make jokes about your memory, because you don't know if the person who you're making the joke to is living with dementia. And that can really make them feel embarrassed and perpetuate these cycles of stigmatization. So practice that as well. So here are some mindful communication tips. I won't walk you through all of them, but I really like them. I adapted them a little bit from the Alzheimer's Tennessee 10 Absolutes of Alzheimer's Care. I actually think this might be from the National Alzheimer's Association, but I couldn't find the original source. So I went with Alzheimer's Tennessee. And so you can walk through these. We train all our volunteers in these communication tips. I have a really bad habit of talking quickly. And I think that's okay when we're rushing to finish a presentation sometimes. But in the context of a memory cafe, I have to very actively remind myself to slow down and to speak more clearly and enunciate. So these are really great to walk through. And I encourage you to share these if you want to share it to your Facebook or wherever. It's just good practice to have in general. So one of the key elements in being dementia friendly, especially in the context of a memory cafe, is to be adaptive in your planning and your expectations. So a successful coordinator or volunteer will be flexible and responsive to the needs of the attendees. Don't get stuck on one vision. Adapt each meeting and each activity as needed. So we sometimes, to calm our own anxieties as planners or as volunteers, we convince ourselves things are going to go one way. And one thing that you can really learn when you talk to any caregiver is expect the unexpected and welcome the unexpected. This is where your improv strengths will really come into play. Yes, and go with the flow. It will result in a much better experience for everybody involved. And we actually had an improv artist come to one of our first in-person memory cafes and teach us the principles of yes and. So a highly adaptable coordinator and volunteer creates an environment where attendees feel a sense of ownership of the memory cafe. So if you come in and you're like, this is what we're doing today, and we're not straying from this, and then what you're doing beyond just kind of maybe preventing some people from enjoying or feeling comfortable is that you're losing out on the opportunity to make people feel like it's their space. If you go with the flow and you say, you know what, Jim, that's a really great idea. Why don't we try doing this today? Then Jim now feels like he owns this space in a way, and that he has the ability to dictate what's happening. And that is so powerful in sustaining your memory cafe. I see Gustavo says, when I'm doing outreach, some people will say, oh, he or she abuses me, or he has old times, and then laughs. And yes, always redirect and don't laugh. That is so helpful, Gustavo, because sometimes you work in APS, it can be really challenging, some of the topics, and nervous humor is real. And so kind of making it acceptable for somebody to laugh at something that's a normal coping strategy, but also validating that it's not really something funny. It takes tact and practice. So thank you for sharing that, Gustavo. This picture always makes me happy, because when you look at this photo, you don't know who's living with dementia and who's not, but you can tell every single person's having a good time. And that was a really fun day. I am a huge fall buff, So this was definitely on my spooky Halloween agenda. So, okay, tips for planning. I'm sorry, this slide is so ugly, but I couldn't fit it all the information on with it. I wanted to put a picture. So being in Texas, it's important to plan bilingual in English Spanish if possible, and I have a slide specifically for that. Importantly, give yourself time. One thing that I'm learning is when we were in person, I didn't necessarily have to plan bilingual activities because people who spoke Spanish would come with their families, and there was just this organic process of translating. But when you're virtual, you need to have, that's why we've recruited Noe, because I don't speak Spanish fluently enough to lead an activity. And so partnering with somebody who you trust is a really great way, not only to expand your partnership and to bring a different personality into the mix, but also to be inclusive. So I'll talk more about that. But the key thing is that you need to give yourself time, because proofreading those documents, I'm getting used to the fact that since I can't proofread, I need to be able to pass it on to multiple different people to get a few eyes on the Spanish language version. Even the English language version, I'm staring at a screen all day. So having that planning ahead is really important. So getting caregiver and person living with dementia input is critical. You can do this at each Memory Café, and I'll talk about that in the evaluations section, but one of the ways that you can do it in a really more systematic and reliable way is to form a planning committee, which we have a dementia-friendly Memory Café working group. So we meet once a month just to talk about activities and what would be the best way to implement activities. And we have a caregiver, we have a couple of caregivers who are committed to that. So getting their feedback is helpful. It's important to eliminate as many barriers as possible for your attendees. So think about what you're conceptualizing within the whole Memory Café, but also within each activity. So you should be willing to work harder to make it easier for your attendees. Never shift the burden onto the attendees. As the coordinator and the volunteer, you take on that. Don't overcomplicate things, keep them simple. I've found that simple is almost always better. Don't be afraid to change plans as needed. Plan activities that can support engagement outside of the Memory Café, and I think this is really important to planning. So provide the materials. So when we do creative conversations, I emailed those prompts to the people who attended, who as I've been doing interviews, they're saying, yeah, I've called my family members. I've sat on the porch with so-and-so and asked them the creative conversations that, and so that's a wonderful opportunity to encourage social engagement beyond the 1 hour or however long you're together. And I love this. This was actually something Gladys recommended, and every interview that I've done for the Memory Café project so far has mentioned this. Incorporating healthy reminders for caregivers. Wow, Gladys, that was so spot on. They really appreciated being reminded to relax their shoulders, take a deep breath. I know what you're going through is hard. So as you engage people, especially in a virtual environment, it was such a well-received and so small. It takes no planning really to remind somebody to relax or take a deep breath, but it goes a long way. So thanks for that recommendation, Gladys. And I have examples of the healthy reminders here. So when you have these, you can click and see what we used for the Loteria game. So this section is for the coordinators or wannabe coordinators. Your role is to adapt to the interest, culture, and needs of your Memory Café attendees. Some Memory Cafés love art and music, while other groups are more interested in physical activity, education, or just chatting over coffee. All of that is welcome in the context of a Memory Café. It's just a matter of whether the people want to do it or not. So a great Memory Café coordinator will keep constant dialogue with attendees to plan around their interests and needs. So the coordinator oversees the planning and implementation of activities. This was, back when we were in person, this was one of my partners who coordinated the Memory Café, Bree. She runs the program to provide transportation for homebound seniors. So as a coordinator, you will likely establish and sustain your memory cafe, research and plan activities, collaborate with community partners, search and apply for funding. You'll be responsible for the promotion of your memory cafe. You'll connect with attendees to adapt to their interests and needs. You'll stay up to date in the best practice for dementia-friendly programming. So always be mindful of your behaviors and what you can learn to be more inclusive in your personal behaviors and your planning. And you'll probably supervise and train volunteers. And your role might go beyond that, but typically speaking, this is sort of on the docket for all coordinators of memory cafes. So here are some tips and logistics that I've learned from coordinating a virtual memory cafe since April. It takes a lot more work to facilitate that organic feel. So to me, it doesn't feel organic, but the response is that people attending feel like our memory cafes are more organic when I plan better. So publicize through your collaborator networks. Don't be territorial. So one of the main things is if you're going through all this effort, you should really promote your memory cafe, because when we were transitioning to virtual, I didn't realize how much more work goes into promoting an online memory cafe until we had done all this work to plan this wonderful activity. It was actually the Papel Picado Day, and we only had one family attend, and that was heartbreaking because it was a wonderful opportunity and it was my mistake. I was still learning, so I didn't promote it enough. So bringing in, after that, we brought in more partners. We're partnering with UTRGV, with the Biggs Institute, with Alzheimer's Association, and that has done wonders for getting a regular base of people. Since then, we've always had at least 20 people on our memory cafe calls, and sometimes more, often more. So pre-registration is helpful. Some of us do pre-registration, some of us don't. When we were in person, I didn't, but now that we're virtual, it really has helped. So I always allow people to register over the phone, and I allow them to attend over the phone. So if somebody registers over the phone, I will let them know, hey, do you need to join over the phone, or do you have a computer? If they don't have a computer, I will take that into consideration as I'm planning, and I'll be checking the participants for the phone only. I'll make sure that the activity can still be enjoyed without the visualization. So reading things, repeating, that's really important. It helps to identify people who need additional support or follow-up. Some people who register over the phone might need help walking through Zoom. So I've had quite a few sessions with families before a memory cafe where I set up a fake memory cafe and I log in the week before so that they'll be comfortable the day of. So you can see how much more work goes into a virtual memory cafe in the planning side. So it's easier if you take pre-reg, it's easier to send reminders, explain more complex. When we did Loteria, I had to give instructions, and you don't necessarily want to do that on a flyer. So when you take pre-registration, you can send more detailed instructions, and I find that really helpful. So I did this graph. I'm presenting for the Percolator Percolator network is this massive memory cafe network in Massachusetts. And I'm presenting in a couple weeks. I'll send you all the invite if you want to join. And they are wonderful. Their network went from 4 memory cafes to over 100 within a couple of years of operation. So really, that's my vision for Texas. And we haven't been a year in yet, so we'll see how that goes. Gustavo says, well, I think it's important to have people attend. Is there a max number that will be too much? Yes, there is. So depending on the activity, Gustavo, you might want to cap your memory cafe. I don't like to do that because I host a national memory cafe. Anyone from anywhere can join. In fact, at one of our sharing days, we had somebody join from France. I didn't know this until I looked at her registration, which was awesome. And so like sharing day, I would feel like it's limitless. You know, we could have as many people as possible, but Loteria, I capped it at, I think it was like 75, because at a certain point some activities, but that's pretty massive. Some memory cafes are only 5 to 10 people. So you can adapt your activity, and pre-registration helps with that. You can be very clear and transparent about the spaces available. And it's helpful to create a wait list. So if you all have questions about that, I can walk you through that. So this graphic just kind of highlights that this part is easy. Getting on a call and talking at a bunch of faces is totally easy. But fostering connection in a virtual environment between families, and you'll see some might only speak Spanish, some might be a couple together. Some might be only on a phone. This is so hard. And it's okay if you're not an expert at it. I'm not. But striving for this should always be at the forefront of your planning. So hosting a bilingual memory cafe is important. So as of August 2020, as of this month, the SA Amigos is the only bilingual memory cafe in Texas. And as far as I can tell, I think there's only 2 in America that are operating bilingual virtually. There are monolingual Spanish memory cafes, but in terms of a bilingual environment, not many people are doing it. So I'm really, really advocating for, if any of y'all are thinking of starting a memory cafe, strive for that. Give it a try, because I really was intimidated by the idea. I'm so easily embarrassed by, not speaking. Yay, thank you for the applause. But I get so embarrassed with what I don't know. But if you just shed your pride a little bit and let yourself be open to it, wow, people are so kind and receptive. And even just trying to have a bilingual memory cafe makes people feel listened to and seen. So here are some tips that I've learned. There's no right way or to do this, so I'm still learning. And I'm excited to have Noe. I feel like I'm going to learn so much more. So plan ahead. Your materials should be translated, proofread, and this came from another member of Gladys's team who advised staying at the 5th grade reading level in English and Spanish. And I know that already, but it's helpful to be reminded of it, because I am engaging in a lot of academic stuff, and I engage with a lot of researchers, and so I sometimes forget that some language isn't accessible in English or Spanish. So since I don't speak Spanish well, and I definitely don't read, or I can't copy edit in Spanish, having a few set of eyes is helpful. So our flyer for September has been, okay, bye Carol, thank you. For September, I've had 2 Spanish speakers look at it so far, and I'm gonna send it over to Noe and Gladys and see if y'all have any more changes before I start sending it out, because I know that we've sent out some flyers with some grammatical issues, and that's okay. People are kind. At least we're trying, but it's better to strive for respecting the language as well. So that's helpful to plan ahead. So this is important when it comes to timing to promote. Consider cultural aspects of translation. So I'm going to give an example in Loteria. The game itself is it's Mexican bingo, and Mexican bingo is pretty much that, but you want to be careful because some of the what is it called, the cards might not culturally translate well. So there are some cards, el negrito, el borracho, and then la sirena doesn't have a bra on in most of the traditional ones. So I don't know, Gustavo, you didn't come to that day, but I saw you unmute.
I know it seems like such a fun thing, because whenever I'm doing stuff with seniors, if Loteria and dance is not available, it's not going to be a good event. And food. So if you have food, music, and dance, and Loteria, you're going to have a successful event.
Hey, that works for me too. Maybe I'm at heart an older adult. But that didn't translate well. We were a national memory cafe. So I wanted to invite people from Massachusetts. People from Princeton University attended our Loteria game and asked us to, after the Memory Cafe, they asked us to train their staff at Princeton on how to host Loteria. But what they didn't know is that for those potentially problematic cards, which are not culturally problematic in Mexican culture, but in like white Massachusetts culture, it is. And so I replaced those cards with el molcajete instead of el borracho. I put a nice little bikini top on La Sirena. And so it still was celebrating Mexican culture and still a chance to teach Spanish language and engage in a traditional activity without making other people who might not be familiar with the game uncomfortable. So those things go a long way. And yes, it took 2 days of photo editing in MS Paint, 300 tablas, but it was worth it. So as coordinators, I'll share that. I know I've shared it with Josie, but if you all want to host a loteria game with the problematic cards replaced, I will happily share that with you all. So I just think that's a fun example of cultural translation. So the coordinator and or facilitator should be fluent in both languages. If the coordinator, me, doesn't speak both languages, co-host with somebody who does, no way, which is wonderful. In fact, I like that structure because I just think I dominate. I have a very dominating personality. So getting the chance to co-host with someone else actually kind of pulls me back, and it's wonderful to have more personalities in the Memory Cafe. So invite your volunteers to speak in Spanish. If that's your comfortable language, normalize using Spanish too. People defer to English because that's the dominant culture. But if you normalize Spanish, which I'm going to work on that in my memory cafes, starting with Spanish instead of English, that's my next goal, because I think we should normalize it so people don't feel like, I don't want Spanish speakers to feel like we're doing them a favor by translating. I want it to just be understood that we can still connect and transcend that language barrier, and that both languages are beautiful and equal. So encourage your attendees to translate their comments when possible. One thing I've learned is that in our first Memory Cafe Loteria that we did bilingual, our attendees were really excited to translate. And they had fun teaching me words in Spanish. And so it kind of helped me get rid of my pride and embarrassment a bit, but it also helped sort of make people feel proud that they could teach their first language to other people. So don't put people on the spot, but if they are comfortable, then welcome that. So getting feedback. So Josie, I hope this helps. And if I don't answer, please unmute if this doesn't answer your question. Did I say we were going till 10 or 10:30 today? I think we're good, right? 10:30, right. So getting feedback. Evaluation forms are helpful. Consider the frequency. As a researcher, and I work with a lot of researchers, we tend to be like, more data, more data, more data. But the Memory Cafe isn't about research. First and foremost, it's a social event. And how many parties have you thrown where then you've passed out evaluation forms after? It kind of kills the vibe. And so I used to pass out eval forms, and then I was like, this doesn't make sense. So it might make sense for a class, but not for a Memory Cafe. Online, it's a little easier. You can send a survey monkey and people can choose to do it on their own time. I would never make a swap required. Like I would never say, fill out this eval form and then you'll get the resource I promise. Like, no, people can fill it out if they want. In fact, you get more meaningful responses if you just take the pressure off, and the people who really have something to say will say it. A suggestion box for in-person cafes really works great. So fun little index cards, you can make it look super cute. That's how we voted on our names. So the SA Amigos wasn't a name chosen by any planner. Our group actually spent 3 months submitting names into a box. And then at our potluck, we all had a really fun time voting on the name. And that's how we got SA Amigos. Which I think at some point somebody, I think it might have been Gladys, who recommended clarifying San Antonio Amigos, but the SA part is the name, so I didn't change it. I think people from San Antonio inviting people from other states are really proud of having San Antonio in the name. So I thought that was sweet. So consider your frequency. What is going to be the most helpful to you without burdening or over surveying your families? Ask people during the memory cafes what interests them. Be receptive to personalities and cultures, but also anxieties. If you notice somebody's gone quiet, why did they go quiet? Is it because they're nervous? Kind of like, you don't want to trigger people. Pay attention to possible signs of discomfort, as well as the people who are enjoying it, who are very clearly enjoying it. So the quiet folks are just as important to be mindful of as the engaged folks. In fact, sometimes it's more important to focus on the people who are not talking. So your volunteers, which I learn more from my volunteers than anyone else, and this is why I miss y'all so much. Your volunteers are actually usually the ones who are, especially in person, sitting side by side with people. So really, as a coordinator, listening to your volunteers will give you so much beneficial insight, and asking your volunteers, what do you think? Because they're the ones who are often really getting to know the people who are attending your Memory Cafe. So for our volunteers, here's some photos. Desiree, Amanda, you're in the little picture. This was our holiday party. That Santa was so cute, wasn't he? So the volunteers will support the implementation of activities during a Memory Cafe. So as a volunteer, you might help the coordinator in planning. I know that you all have given me so many good ideas for planning. Set up and clean the room, engaging families living with dementia and keeping an eye out for those who are not engaged, which Desiree does a good job in our online cafes, monitoring the chat function and helping keep the chat going as well. Doing activities, it might not feel like you're volunteering if you're sitting there and painting a pumpkin, but that is good work because you might be able to find someone who's sitting alone, and just sitting side by side with them and painting a pumpkin is really meaningful and is work that is helpful. Staying up to date in best practice for dementia-friendly programs and behaviors, and adapting the activity to the needs of families living with dementia. So this speaks to Annalisa's comment. If you have a well-trained volunteer, they will identify the people who might be struggling with an activity and work with them to adapt it in a way that's enjoyable for them. So that's a really great use of volunteers in person. So the virtual volunteer might monitor a chat box, make check-in calls before the event. We do have a volunteer who every week is making calls to families living with dementia, family caregivers. They might provide tech assistance before, like days before, or even at the beginning of the Memory Cafe. You might sit on a work group to plan activities with your coordinator. And providing observational notes, like Desiree goes above and beyond when she volunteers for our virtual Memory Cafe and provides me not only the attendee list by keeping track of who has logged in, but also any observational notes like this person said this, or this, I noticed this. And that really is helpful because when you're leading a Memory Cafe, it's really hard to pay attention to things that are going on. So as a volunteer, coming from the coordinator perspective, what really helps me is when you can provide me your insight. Hey, I noticed so-and-so turned their camera off. Do you think they were nervous or something like that? That really helps me because I might miss all of that. So volunteering for Memory Cafes can be a highly rewarding experience. To be a great volunteer, and Desiree, I think I'm modeling you and our other volunteers, Amanda and Tiziana who are on the call, with the Memory Cafes in particular, you would commit consistently. So people living with dementia really do benefit from seeing familiar faces. And so I'm not saying it's wrong to volunteer for just one Memory Cafe, but if you can make room to attend regularly, not only will the person living with dementia benefit, but you will too, because you'll get to grow a relationship. And especially in your nursing practice or from whatever professional background you're coming with, understanding that the relationship with families over time is just as important to your practice as kind of being in and out is really helpful. So communicating with your coordinators and your co-volunteers regularly, checking in. Sometimes as the coordinator, I have to say, I get really busy and I might forget to check in with you and to keep you up to date. So I'll do my best doing that, but also invite volunteers to reach out to me. And Desiree does a really great job of that, saying, hey, you haven't sent me this yet. It's not your responsibility, but it is helpful. So you never ask a person their diagnosis or too personal questions. This isn't a doctor's appointment. If someone wants to share, they can share, but it might make someone uncomfortable if you say, what's your diagnosis? How long have you been living with Alzheimer's? That's not necessarily welcoming. Even if it feels like that's what if the person is open to it, they might be, and then they might start to get uncomfortable if they notice someone else is listening. So be flexible and adaptable, go with the flow. You may hear some challenging stories. So be mindful of your own mental and emotional health. A lot of us as coordinators, we have access to resources and training and peers that we talk to about some of the more challenging sides of hearing of someone passing away or transitioning into a care facility. But as a volunteer, you might not have that, and it might be your first experience hearing some of these really heartbreaking experiences. And I know Gustavo works in a really sensitive field. Um, Understand, like, but you have access, I'm sure, to a group of peers who you can discuss this with. But as a volunteer, you might not. You unmuted, Gustavo.
Yes, I mean, we do recommend that, we have like EPA employee, counseling and stuff that, if we have access to it, we don't have to do it, but if we need it, we do have it.
Right, yeah. But as a student, you might not. I mean, not to say as your coordinator, I would be willing and happily to engage in, a private conversation if you're struggling, but just be mindful of your mental and emotional health because we do hear of loss and grief and it is challenging. So talk to your coordinator.
I'd like to, if I could just, you had mentioned earlier about how that one should say like how you understand. But I'll tell you from personal experience, when my father was diagnosed and I had no idea about dementia. I mean, I was like just so green to the whole thing. And like the nurses and at the hospital were telling me like, we understand how you feel. And I'm like, no, you don't. And it was actually like frustrating and it was making me mad. And
Mm-hmm.
and like having learned it, and I know where they were coming from, but when it was happening to me, I did not like it. So I don't know what alternative language to use for somebody who's in that moment, because for me it was like, why does everybody keep saying that they understand? Like they don't understand what's happening to me because I don't even understand, but how can they know? And so for me it was very emotional because I didn't understand, and I didn't want for anybody to tell me that they did because I hadn't even like processed it yet. And so it was
Mm-hmm.
very challenging.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. And that's what I think is so powerful about memory cafes is because you might not necessarily at that point, I mean, maybe now, but a lot of people, especially I think not to call out men, but it's harder for men, I think, to connect emotionally sometimes. We condition men to swallow their feelings a lot. And so connecting and sharing in that capacity might be difficult for anyone. But that's what I like about memory cafes because you can be in an environment, like if you had access to a memory cafe when you were just learning of your father's diagnosis, maybe you could have sat alongside somebody who you actually felt did understand or who was going through, so, but that is, as from the volunteer and the coordinator side, that's really helpful feedback because I think our impulse is to say, yeah, I get it. But you're right, that can be insulting because you don't get it. Like, this is my dad, this is my experience. You don't understand. And so I think we're all learning together. And that's when I say, like, being vulnerable as a volunteer and a coordinator is really important because Gustavo in that situation should have felt comfortable enough with the person saying that to say, excuse me, but I don't think you understand. And that person, if they're a good volunteer or a good health professional, would say, you know what, I apologize, you're right, and listen and be receptive. But that's not always the case. But it is helpful for us as volunteers and coordinators to be mindful that we might not mean to be hurting somebody with our language, but sometimes we do. And it's okay. It's not your intention, but it might still be the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, and now I understand.
Mm-hmm.
It's just perspective, but um, it's just, I mean, it's a challenging moment for anyone to find out that their loved one is this a progressive disease. And I mean, since that moment, I studied and researched, and then I ended up working for APS because at the time I was working for the university. I was working for UTRGV, which was UT Pan Am back then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, it was just a moment in my life that like nobody understood. I didn't understand myself. So if you're telling me that you understand, it's like, get away from me. Like, I don't need you to talk to me.
That's so helpful. That is, it's because we often, especially as volunteers, especially in person, will be having these conversations. They do come up. And so it is mindful. Jennifer offered some great alternatives if that situation ever comes up, saying, I hear you. Do you want to talk about this more? I'm here to talk when you are ready. And there are ways where we can adapt our behavior, where we don't co-opt a person's experience to make ourselves feel better. A lot of the times when we have these conversations to be supportive, we might think we're trying to help that person feel better, but what we're really doing is trying to make ourselves feel more comfortable in that moment. So being mindful to put the other person first. And Jennifer, I like that languaging a lot. So thank you. Thank you, Gustavo. So yes, talk to your coordinator if you notice something concerning. Gustavo's example, actually, if that came up in a memory cafe, that's something I as a coordinator would want to know. It was happening in my memory cafe. So if somebody shares with you, I'm really struggling, but I can't cope, that's something that definitely relay that to your coordinator. Without indulging anything. Sometimes they might be telling you this in confidence. So respect their confidence in you, but share with your coordinator as well as needed. So here is just one slide of additional resources just to get us started. The Percolator Network Memory Cafe Toolkit is the third bullet point, and I have that in the Google folder. And that's something that we're in the process of right now for this Memory Cafe project to adapt for South Texas. So there's going to be a lot of what you saw today will be more fleshed out into an actual usable handbook. And what I'm learning about, especially I think the real benefit will be, and the differentiation between the Memory Cafe Toolkit created by the Percolator Network is the bilingual side and the celebrating culture. And, I think there's so much beauty in Texas culture. And I think being a border state is a really powerful thing. So really celebrating that in our toolkit is going to be a key feature that distinguishes this toolkit from theirs. We do have a Google group. It's not super active, but if you do host a Memory Cafe, please ask me to join that Google group, and it will connect you to a listserv that you can just email your flyer to and so on to promote your Memory Cafe within the people who have ever joined that group through this network. The Alzheimer's Association is so Kelsey is here listening in, and Ginny, I kind of ran through these slides because I know Diane I was originally going to invite her to sort of share, but I know she's out sick today last minute. So I don't know, do you have a moment, I know that you're looking for community engagement volunteers. Do you have anything to say about that?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. And oh my gosh, Sarah, you're just such a great presenter. All this information is just incredibly helpful every time I hear it. So yes, we're always recruiting for volunteers to most certainly help with memory cafes, but also, we are completely strictly doing everything online right now. So all of our classes and our caregiver support groups are being done through Zoom. And we're still tasked with most definitely recruiting and training volunteers to help us do those presentations and facilitate those groups. And we have all the training that goes along with it. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity just to share that. We're doing morning classes, mid-afternoon classes. We have a behaviors class tonight at 5:30 that Dr. Lozano is doing. And the great thing is we also have pretty much the resources of all the chapters in Texas and beyond, because if it's virtual, it doesn't matter what zip code you're in, you can attend. So if you can't attend behaviors tonight, but another chapter is doing it tomorrow online, it's all free. So you can most definitely find classes all the time, and we just need volunteers to help us do the presenting. And we have tried, we're really trying to be the last 2 classes that we have scheduled in Spanish language, we have had 0 people attend, and it's really So we know we've got to do something different. We've got to try things differently because we are just not reaching people who, and we know there's a million reasons. You know, some people don't have access to all of this like we do. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why people can join in, but we're going to keep trying. So thanks.
Well, I would be happy to collaborate with you on trying to think of some outreach. I think what I'm learning a lot about online events is actually, I think the monolingual in either English or Spanish are difficult. I'm finding that the bilingual elements, it takes more planning on your side, but it actually makes people more comfortable. And so maybe it's that you offer it bilingual instead of Spanish only, and then maybe it would result in people who sort of like, we have a lot of, actually the majority of people in our Memory Cafe speak English. But there are a few people who might be joining with a loved one who only speaks Spanish. They speak English, but you know, so it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I do like the idea of bilingual over monolingual anything.
Okay.
Yeah. Let me know
Thank
if there's
you.
anything I can help. I
Thanks.
know that y'all are starting some social engagement activities and trying to ramp that up. The Alzheimer's Association, typically in Texas and nationally, usually are behind a lot of the memory cafes that exist in the US. And so the Alzheimer's Association is a really important strategic partner in getting the word out. So if y'all have memory cafes, look for the Alzheimer's Association in your area and see if you can partner, because it really is great. So thank you, Jenny. We have a few minutes. I wanted to just kind of open up some time for any thoughts or comments or questions.
Hey, it's Ashley. I actually have a question that's completely off topic for Jenny. The class that you mentioned over behaviors that's happening this afternoon, could you send me the info for that? I've got a family that I think would benefit.
Absolutely. And I'll put where you can find all of our classes. I'm going to put that in the chat right now too.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sarah, this is Gladys. I wanted to comment. I mean, you are just awesome.
Oh, thank you.
I think that, you know, I feel very, very grateful and lucky that, you know, you are doing this and that you are sharing your knowledge. You know, I think that's very, very valuable. And you are a role model.
Thank you.
So
well, I have benefited a lot from learning from you, Gladys. Gladys, since we became virtual and have been able to partner, I have really tried to learn so much. You're so giving, you and your team, with your feedback. And I think a good coordinator takes that feedback with no pride. You know, we're going to mess up sometimes.
No, really, I really mean it. And I think that we all feel that sense of gratitude and how lucky we are to have you there. Also, I wanted to expand a little bit on what you said about bilingualism. And the thing is that there are some things, some words that you can only express in your native language, even some expressions. And sometimes, particularly for when you are trying to remembering stuff, then you know, so having the freedom to just say it in English and Spanish or Spanish, you know, it doesn't matter. You know, people are understanding what you are saying. So I think this is one of the values. If you ask everybody in the bilingual cafe is bilingual, probably yes. But having the opportunity to just say something like "ay, mijo," you know, or so anything that comes spontaneously, I think that's very, very valuable. And I think that that's one very important aspect that made your cafe, the San Antonio Cafe, which is our cafe now, very valuable.
Yes, I really appreciate that. Yes. Some things don't translate. My family's Arab, and we, you know, most of my family only speaks Arabic. They're monolingual Arabic, and I can't tell people what they're saying because there's no English translation, and I'm sure the same is for Spanish. And I love the idea of cultivating an environment where, like Gladys said, that's okay. Not everyone, we do our best to translate for practical reasons, but really I think the more important element is exactly that. For true, honest expression, you need an environment where people can feel free to code switch and to go back and forth in, you know, I guess the word is Spanglish, you know, to be able to go back and forth and to feel comfortable to express themselves in whatever language in that moment. And I've noticed over time, as we're getting better at this bilingual virtual environment, people will just code switch. They'll go back and forth. And I love that. I just think it's really exciting. So thank you.
I think that one of the things that's challenging, and I love dichos, and so there's like these idioms, right? Like sayings, and so I find myself always like saying them, and when I was growing up, I just thought it was like I would hear my grandparents or my tios and my mom say this, and I'm like why are you even like, what is that? And so now I'm like constantly saying them, and those are hard to translate because, you know, so you kind of, you don't like necessarily translate word per word, but more like the feel of it, like kind of like the kind of the meaning behind it. And so I kind of feel like it's not an exact translation, but you want to kind of give people the feeling of what you're talking about. And I think that's good enough, because a literal translation doesn't necessarily work all the time.
Exactly. That ties into the sort of cultural side. I think in my work, you know, with researchers, we always like to say culturally relevant, but like, what does that mean? You know, what does it really mean? And I think it's more of the culture is that it's not about being relevant to this culture or that. It's about creating a culture in our spaces where we don't have to cater and it is what it is, and people can express. And the culture is that we celebrate all cultures and all languages, and we don't have to. I'm trying to break away from this idea that English is being catered to, that people speaking Spanish have to adapt for the English speakers. I would really like to sort of shift that mentality, and instead of accommodating one group, we are just one group together, and we are what we are together. And I know that's a little bit like whimsical and whatever, but I think it goes a long way with sort of leveling and not making a one group the priority and this other group is sort of tacked on. You know, does that make sense?
And I think what you were saying, that you're not really good in Spanish, and I find sometimes that even though it was my first language, sometimes I kind of get stuck on certain things. And so I kind of sort of explain it, and I'm even like in a presentation, and people are like, oh, this is what you mean. And oh yeah, that, so they help you out. And they, like you said, they are very forgiving, and they understand that what you're trying to say, and they'll pitch in and help you out.
Exactly. When you're open to that, really beautiful things happen. So any last comments from coordinators or volunteers?
Sarah, can I jump in there for a few minutes? I just, again, want to thank you for your support. I know Camille's Memory Cafe is running smoothly because of a lot of the help and guidance that I get from you. So I want to thank you so much publicly. I also want to invite everyone here that's sharing this great experience, that Camille's Memory Cafe has an ongoing series called Alzheimer's Baseball. And that has really gone well with a lot of our group. We have two really great volunteers, Vic Figurelli and Jim Kenton. And now they're going to expand kind of the topics of conversation to music, also maybe some history, and maybe even classic movies. So they're really growing the program. And I invite you all, we're actually expanding Camille's Memory Cafe to twice a month now. So, and again, Sarah, it has to do with your guidance about how to keep moving forward. So we're really, really fortunate to have this network of support. So thank you all. And I'll post the information for those of you who would like to attend. And so I just want to say thank you. It's a great service for our community. And it's been one of our signature programs for A Gift of Time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Josie. I love your Memory Cafe. What I'll do in the follow-up email to this meeting is share whatever resources. I will share the memory cafes that I know are currently active online. I'm working on, Gladys had a great idea for a calendar of events, but it's a little hard. What I'm struggling with is prioritizing what events go into that calendar without duplicating work. We always come back to this. So what I might do is try to create a South Texas or a Texas Memory Cafe calendar at the very least. So all of our activities are in one place and we can circulate that. So send me your stuff. I'll send it to you all. We're a minute over time, but does anybody have any last thoughts before we wave goodbye? No? Okay, well, thank you all for your time. Really, I love seeing all your faces and my volunteers. Please consider this volunteer hours, and if you need me to sign off on your hours, we can figure that out. Oh, sorry, was someone speaking? No? Okay. Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Bye, Sarah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, volunteers.
Bye. Bye, Noe.